So where do the holes in bread come from? Well, that's an interesting question. We're going to find out in this video. Hi, hello and welcome again. Microbehunter here. I'm Oliver. Well, you of course all know that you have to add yeast to bread dough, and when you add yeast and let the dough rest, then it starts to rise and becomes bigger and fluffier. But what's actually going on here? And what does the yeast do? And why does it give us these nice tiny holes inside the bread? Well, if you don't add yeast, then the bread can turn out quite dense and hard and not very pleasant to chew. And the yeast is what makes the bread light and soft and airy. And if you cut through a loaf of bread, then you can see all of these holes inside. And those holes are bubbles of a gas that the yeast has produced. So what's the yeast now actually doing? Well, yeast, they are living microorganisms. They're tiny fungi. And when they're mixed into the dough, then they start breaking down the sugars inside the dough. Some of the sugars come directly from the flour itself because enzymes in the yeast slowly convert the starch in the flour back into sugars, and sometimes we can also add a bit of sugar directly to give the yeast something to start with. The yeast then carries out a process called alcoholic fermentation. Well, it's a similar process as when making wine and beer, because in this process the yeast converts the sugar into carbon dioxide gas and also alcohol, ethanol. And the important part for our bread now is the carbon dioxide, because this gas is released inside the dough. It gets trapped and it forms those bubbles. And the more CO2, carbon dioxide, is produced, these bubbles, they expand and the whole dough starts to grow in volume, and it also rises. You can actually watch the yeast produce carbon dioxide bubbles under the microscope. First you see many small bubbles forming, but over time these bubbles grow larger and some of them start to fuse together. The tiny dots you see between and around the bubbles, these are yeast cells themselves doing the work. Now, when you bake the bread later, two things happen. Well, first of all, of course, the heat kills the yeast cells, so they stop working. And the alcohol, well, the alcohol mostly evaporates. The gas bubbles, the carbon dioxide bubbles, however, they stay in place as the dough sets, and that is what we see as the holes inside the finished bread. People have been using yeast for bread and also for drinks like beer and wine for thousands of years, long before anyone knew anything about microorganisms. Ancient cultures already noticed that adding a bit of so-called old dough, or also foam from the brewing, they made their bread lighter and also tastier. So, and only much later did scientists discover that this was actually because of the living yeast cells doing their work. Yeah, and by the way, you don't always have to add yeast to make these bubbles of carbon dioxide, because in many cakes and quick breads, we use baking powder instead. And this is a chemical mixture that releases carbon dioxide gas when it gets wet and warm. The carbon dioxide forms bubbles in the dough or in the batter in a very similar way, and that's why cakes also have those holes and a light fluffy texture, even though there are no yeast cells doing the work here. So, well, I hope you found this interesting, and maybe you'll think of yeast cells the next time when you cut into a fresh loaf of bread. From my side, that's all I would like to share with you. I wish you all the best. Happy microbe hunting as always, and hope to see you again in the next video. Bye bye.